get started. Welcome everybody. So I'm Daniel Ziblatt, and this is part of a series. This is our last installment in this wonderful series. Wonderful, I mean, with intellectually speaking, at least, of our series, Questions of Fascism and Democracy, which I've been sharing with Peter Gordon, my colleague, who's sitting right here. This semester, we've had really a whole range of events on different topics connected to fascism and democracy. And these last two sessions, last week's with Steve Hansen and Jeff Kopstein, was about a new book. And then this lecture today is part of our discussion of a new book, Intent to Destroy. Normally, we preface this session by saying what's happening next week, but this is it. I don't know if we plan to do this next year or not. The topic, unfortunately, will still be with us, so we'll see. But welcome, everybody, and I wanted to introduce our speaker as well as our discussant today. So first, I'll say a word about our speaker. So Yevgeny Finkel was born in Ukraine and grew up in Israel. He received a BA in Political Science and International Relations at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a PhD in Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has spent his career studying how individuals respond to mass political violence. And I first got to know him as he was finishing, I think, his dissertation, which became a great first book entitled Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, Princeton University Press, 2017, which is really a very important work that I encourage you all to look at. He's also the author of Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, a book co-authored with Scott Gelbach in 2020, and lots of articles in the leading political science journals. But what brings us together today is to discuss his book, Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine, which came out last year. So we're looking very much forward to your discussion of the book. And to serve as discussant, I think we really are in for a treat that we have really the perfect person to discuss the book, Serhiy Plokhii, our colleague here at Harvard, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, professor of Ukrainian history and also the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute. He's written many books, too many to mention here, but just some ones that I know and that I think are relevant. The Russia-Ukrainian War, The Return of History in 2023. It's been an important book. Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters. The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union. And his books have won numerous prizes, including the Lionel Gelber Prize in 2015 and the Baillie Gifford Prize, among others. So the way we're going to proceed today is hear about a 30-minute talk on introducing us to the book and encouraging all of us to go buy the book afterwards. And then we'll hear about a 10-minute commentary from Serhiy, and then we will open it up for discussion. So, Evgeny, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. So, thank you. Okay. So, thanks then so much for inviting me and for organizing this, and thanks Serhiy for commenting on the book later on. And so, as Dan said, my talk today is based on my book, Intent to Destroy, which came out last year with Basic Books last November. So if you like the talk, please buy the book. You will find more stuff there. If you don't like the talk, I still hope you buy the book. Maybe it will convince you that I'm right. After all, at best and at worst, you will have more reasons to dislike my talk. Now, here is the book. So on the left is the UK edition. On the right is the US one. You decide which one is more macabre. But that was the goal. It's not an academic manuscript as such. It aimed more as a general public. And the working title as I wrote the book was To Kill Ukraine, because that's essentially what I tried to explain: Russian violence against Ukraine, both the country and the people. Eventually, the publisher decided that even for them it was too much and sounded more like a do-it-yourself manuscript, so we switched to Intent to Destroy, but I think both convey what I wanted to say. And I started this book as an attempt to understand a puzzle of Russian violence against civilians since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. And if you follow the news about the war, then you obviously know that violence against civilians is the key feature of this war. The destruction of the entire cities like Mariupol, mass executions in places like Bucha, Izum, and even some more gruesome stuff that eventually gets to the headlines like beheadings, impaling heads on sticks, castrating live POWs with box cutters, etc., etc., etc. And this violence was a puzzle, especially at the very beginning, if you go back to Russia's official narrative of the war, that it's essentially a war of liberation of Ukraine's long-suffering and oppressed Russian speakers who are being mistreated and repressed by the Kiev's neo-Nazi regime. Now, I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist, but I still know enough about history of wars to tell you that true, genuine liberation typically does not involve beheading the people you are presumably liberating. So that was the puzzle that I tried to explain, but as I started to write this book, I realized that I can't explain it by starting with 2022, and not even 2014 with Russia annexed Crimea and Russian citizens with deep connections to the Russian security services started the war in the Donbass. I had to go back in time, and eventually as I went back and back, it became a historical narrative that covers the last 200 years. So I do talk about the current war and the violence in the book, and I will be more than happy to talk about it during the Q&A, but the focus switched a bit from trying to explain the war, because as a political scientist, I'm trained to explain more or less current events, to trying to trace and understand how, over the last 200 years, the staple of Russian policy and Russian thinking about Ukraine was trying to dominate the region and, if needed, destroy it. But, since we're at the university setting and most of you seem like students, let's do a short quiz. So, here are 3 quotes. How many of them belong to Putin? 1, 2, 3, and if not 3, then how many? 3? Anyone? 3? 0. No, I wouldn't be putting it as 0. Sorry? All of them? Actually, just one. The first one. The first one is Vladimir Putin from his July 2021 article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he told us explicitly what the thinking is and also implied what he intends to do, and we all said no, he doesn't mean it. Well, actually, he did. What are the other 2? Well, the other 2 are also from Russian leaders. So the second one is the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army in 1914, justifying the Russian invasion of Galicia and Bukovina, the Ukrainian parts of Austro-Hungary. And the third one is Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs of Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, justifying the invasion of Poland in September 1939 when Stalin and Hitler decided to carve up Poland. So here we have 3 almost identical citations, 3 almost identical things said by 3 very different Russian leaders, Imperial Soviet and the current Russian. And again, if you don't know the history, it's very hard to understand who said what. So what I try to explain is what drives those continuities, where do they come from, and also how do they translate into action. So let me tell you briefly what my argument in a nutshell, and then demonstrate it on several cases. So my argument in a nutshell is that over the last 200 years, with some brief interruptions in 1920s and 1990s, controlling and dominating Ukraine was the key goal of Imperial Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet governments. And this desire to dominate Ukraine, or what you can reasonably describe as an absolute obsession with Ukraine, is driven by 2 factors: identity and security. So let's start with identity, because for me, identity is much more important than security, even though quite a few of my colleagues in international relations, including here at Harvard Kennedy School, would rather talk about security rather than identity, but still. So for most Russians, in a nutshell, being Russian implies a very special relations with, and very often a sense of entitlement to, at least some parts of Ukraine and its past. And this identity-based view rests on 3 components. If you're an expert on Ukraine, I won't be telling you, much new, but I presume that not everyone here knows this history. So, the first component of this identity-based view is that Russia and Ukraine both trace their history to the same place. Kievan Rus, a medieval East Slavic state that encompassed most of modern Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia. In the 30th century, the state was destroyed by the Mongols, and the area that is now Ukraine was quickly absorbed by the Polish and Lithuanian states, while Moscow emerged from an absolutely marginal, small principality to become a major imperial power with an imperial ambition, but even more importantly, a belief that it's an heir of Kiev as the head, as the capital of this Slavic state, and has a natural right to control all those lands. The second feature of this, or the second prong of this identity belief, is that the Russian nation consists of three branches. The Great Russians, which are Russians, Little Russians, who are Ukrainians, and the White Russians, who are Belarusians. Now, the terms Great and Little Russians also imply hierarchical relationship. We are on top, you are below us. It wasn't originally meant this way. Originally, it was just geographical terms to describe distances like Asia Minor. But once you start using the language of great and little, it has to evolve into hierarchical relationship, which is exactly what it did. So a lot of the Russian perception of Ukraine and also the Russian policies towards Ukraine, especially since 2014, can be boiled down to how dare you, who you think you are to defy us. And the third component is the idea that those three branches have only one proper language for literature, science, poetry, administration, and this language is, of course, Russian. Ukrainian is just a peasant dialect, a vernacular that does not deserve its own literature, its own academic space. In fact, using Ukrainian for those purposes will be just a waste of resources. Why do it Ukrainian when you can or should be doing it in Russian? And again, most people who know anything about Russia and Ukraine are aware of those points. They are cornerstones of Russian identity and historiography. What most people do not realize, and that's where we get to the security component, is how recent they are. And they're essentially a result of 19th century fight between the Russian Empire and the Polish independence movement. Why? Because before 17th and 19th century, most of Ukraine belonged to Poland, and it meant that most of the nobility and the very large part of the urban population in what is now Ukraine were Catholic Poles. When Russia, Prussia, and Austria partitioned Poland out of existence, most of this territory, almost all of historical Ukraine, went to the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire had to deal with the Polish independent movement that wanted to recreate the Polish state and also thought of this area of Ukraine as part of this future or re-established Polish state, and the Russians had to suppress pretty large-scale, very bloody uprisings in 1830s and 1860s. So the fear was that local Polish elites and the urban middle classes will somehow corrupt the Slavic Orthodox peasants, who are now Ukrainians, and turn them into Poles or into Catholics. So since the beginning of the 19th century, to counteract this Polish influence, the Russian government started a campaign of trying to emphasize the Russian origins of Ukraine, which eventually in the 1860s evolved into a campaign of forced Russification, precisely for security reasons of protecting the Russian Empire from the Poles. But security is not just about the Poles, of course. There is also the question of national security, and there is a wonderful history of Ukraine written by Professor Plokhy with the title Gates of Europe, because that's essentially what Ukraine is. And gates occasionally open both ways. And that's what Ukraine is. So historically, most of Western invasions of Russia went through Ukraine's, and there are natural defenses between rest of Europe and Ukraine, but there is mostly an open steppe between Ukraine and Russia. So the area is traditionally perceived as crucial for Russian national security, but even more importantly, and here we get to the questions of democracy, is the regime security component. Because nothing scares the Russian autocrat than a democratic Ukraine, because if Ukrainians and Russians are essentially the same people, and if Ukrainians manage to build a democracy, then God forbid, Russians might want and try to do this as well. Now, it's a catch-22 situation for the Kremlin because they can deal it quite easily by saying, no, those are actually different people with different histories and different perceptions, but that would undermine the identity basis of the regime. So they're stuck with the belief that, in order to protect the regime, they need to prevent Ukraine from becoming democratic. How you do it? Controlling it either de jure or de facto. And my final point is that repression is costly. So while the Russian elites, and it doesn't matter whether those are Imperial Russian or Soviet, and here I'm using Soviet and Russian interchangeably, which is not historically entirely correct, but I will still do it. But still, they would rather do it on the cheap, without much violence. How do you do it? Well, you do it by leveraging an extreme diversity of Ukraine. Because Ukraine historically is an extremely diverse place. When I started in the book listing all the major communities that called Ukraine home, the list went to about 3 to 4 lines of text. This diversity has been diminished substantially since World War II, but it still exists. So what do? You do what I call the divide and repress strategy, where you identify groups that are at any given time perceived as the key danger for the regime and repress them mercilessly. While at the same time, you use other groups as local agents to provide main power, to provide local knowledge, to provide legitimacy. And the outcome is that over the last 200 years, there have always been groups in Ukraine who were safe and prioritized over their neighbors and were used as local agents for the regime, while other groups were mercilessly repressed. And who those local agents are also could change over time. It could be traditional Ukrainian elites, it could be the working class, it could be the minority, such as the Jews. The point is that this divide and repress strategy worked quite successfully for 200 years. And in my view, what explains the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022 is that for the first time, this strategy failed. Because for the first time since 2014, since the Russian annexation of Crimea, we see an emergence of a truly political civic nation in Ukraine that, of course, did not disappear all those cleavages. I'm not saying that, suddenly since 2014, Ukrainian society became monolithic and liberal democratic, and there are no pro-Russian people in Ukraine, and there is no far right in Ukraine. Of course there is. But the point is that since 2014, the vast majority of the Ukrainian population does prefer an independent Ukraine. Partly, it's just the sheer impact of Russian 2014 annexation of Crimea, and many people in Ukraine, especially in the east, took it as a personal offense. Those people who were traditionally more sympathetic towards Russia took it very personally. Second, it's just an issue of habit. Ukraine is an independent state since 1992. So most people, especially the younger generation, they do not know any other country, and they would rather not live in Russia if they can have normal lives in Ukraine. And those people are leading the fight for Ukraine's independence. President Zelensky and I were born in the same year. We were 14 when the Soviet Union collapsed. We absolutely have zero nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And the people of the younger generation, for them, Ukraine is the only country they know. And in part, is just looking across the border and seeing what Russia has become and not wanting this future or this existence for themselves and their children. And this strategy, so that meant that while Putin would have preferred, even in 2022, to dominate Ukraine and controlling de facto rather than de jure, turning it into a client state similar to Belarus, he would have done it, of course. The point is that in 2022, he could not. So the only way to realize this control of Ukraine was through military invasion, and the failure of this divide and repress strategy also, in my view, explains the violence against Ukrainian civilians. Why? Because Russians were so confident in their view of Ukraine and that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people that many of them did genuinely believe that they will be greeted as liberators when they come in. And when that did not happen and they were met with bullets rather than with flowers, the perception of Ukrainians switched from being brothers to not even being enemies, but worse than enemies, traitors. And this violence against civilians, again, here I'm making a leap of faith because we still don't have enough data, but I think we still have enough anecdotal data to make educated guesses. From what I see, from what I saw while writing this book, that this violence, especially violence against civilians, is to a large degree driven by revenge rather than any strategic calculations. So those are my arguments. In a nutshell, let's see how they work in practice, very briefly. So here I want to focus on one particular episode that is not really known even within Ukraine itself. And that's the Russian occupation of Austro-Hungarian Galicia and Bukovina during World War I, and where we will see how those ideas translate into practice. So what happens there? After the partition of Poland, almost all Ukrainian lands go to the Russian Empire, with the exception of the area here that goes to the Habsburgs. And the situation of Ukrainians in the Habsburg Empire is very different. While the Russian Empire tries to Russify the Ukrainians, the guiding principle of the Habsburgs is ethnic tolerance. So their Ukrainians are allowed to have their parties, to speak their language, to publish books. They have their educational system. Their classes taught at the University of Lviv, which is the main educational institution of the area in Russian. There is a chair of Ukrainian history occupied by Mikhailo Hrushevsky, whose Professor Plohis chair is named after him. And that means that those Ukrainian activists within the Russian Empire who do not want to be repressed move to Western Ukraine and start operating there. Again, Professor Hrushevsky, who is essentially the founding father of the Ukrainian national movement and the first president of the Ukrainian state after World War I, was a Russian subject, but he taught at the University of Lviv. And from the Russian perspective, it's a mortal danger. From their perspective, they need to destroy this island of Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian politics, because if they leave it untouched, it will spread to the Russian Ukraine and literally destroy the empire from within. Why? Because in the early 20th century, the politics of the Russian Empire switches from the divine right of the Romanov Empire to mass politics, parliaments, elections, and they know the math. And the math is very simple. If Ukrainians are little Russians, then together Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are about 66 to 67% of the empire. If those little Russians are not Russians but something else, the share of Russians in their own empire goes down to about 44%. In other words, they become a minority in their own state, and that is a mortal danger for the Romanov Empire. How do they deal with that? Well, they develop a two-pronged approach. First, they start finding pro-Russian activists in Galicia. They start creating clubs. They start sending money to local activists. And even back then, in 1913, 1914, there are people on the ground in Galicia screaming bloody murder. What are you doing? They're now finding those people. And then at some point when they need it, they will say, we need to protect those people from oppression, and they will invade. Which is the same rhetoric that the Kremlin used in 2014 and 2022. And the second prong was to beef up anti-Ukrainian propaganda in Russia itself, to claim that Ukrainians are a fake nation, that Ukrainian idea is the fake idea, and it's all an invention of the Austrians, that they are literally officers in the Austrian army general staff, sitting day and night, and their job is to create the Ukrainian nation. Now, the same rhetoric is there, just instead of Austrians and Germans, those are the Brits, the Americans, or the Anglo-Saxons, but the idea is the same. Ukraine is a fake nation, it's a fake identity manufactured by enemies of Russia to harm Russia. And again, if you follow the Russian rhetoric since 2022, that is their main perception of Ukraine. So what happens when the war begins? Well, I already showed you the quote from Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. The Tsar Nicholas II is even more explicit. For him, taking over Galicia and Bukovina is Russia returning to its natural borders. Those people are Russians. Of course, nobody asks those people how they see themselves and whether they want to be Russians. A side note, they do not, and they did not. But again, if from the Russian perspective they're Russians, nothing else matters. The war goes very poorly for the Austro-Hungarians, and by early September 1914, Russia occupies almost all of this region, and they immediately start talking about annexation. That's the explicit goal. They want to annex it as the war going. Eventually, they decide they will have to wait some time until the war is over. They need to annex it as part of the peace treaty, but they will still govern this region as Russian de facto. And it's not just the nationalists and the monarchists. Constitutional Democrats, the main Russian Liberal Party, are also fully on board. Everyone in Russia views this region as Russian. So they decide that they cannot annex it, but they will still govern it as if it's a part of Russia. What does it mean for the region being governed as a part of Russia? First, mass violence against civilians. There is a huge wave of pogroms, mostly against the Jews. It's massive plunder of everything that can be stolen. You name it. I haven't seen any reports of kitchen sinks or bathtubs, probably because they simply did not exist by and large. But other than that, everything goes. My favorite story is how here in the city of Chernovtsi, Russian cavalry unit destroyed the specimen collection of the local zoology department. They broke the jars in which the specimens were preserved and drank the alcohol in which they were preserved. But even more importantly, they also tried to remake the region and make it Russian. What does it mean? It means removing all the civil servants who are not on board, especially the Jews, and starting sending bureaucrats from Russia to govern those regions, according to Russian laws, of course, switch the language of the region to Russian, even though almost no one in the region speaks Russian. And besides the Ukrainians, the other main communities, the Jews and the Poles, do not even use Cyrillic alphabet, changing the names of streets and start renaming them after Russian leaders. They even changed the local time zone to that of St. Petersburg. They also banned the Ukrainian language. Nothing can be published in Ukrainian, not even fairy tales or calendars. You can't even send mail. In Ukrainian, the postal censors are instructed to destroy all correspondence in Ukrainian, while they had no problem with correspondence in German, the language of the enemy, or Polish, or French, or Romanian, or Czech. Only two languages are banned, Ukrainian and Yiddish. They shut down all the Ukrainian schools. And once they're allowed to reopen, only at the elementary school level. Below that, teachers are forced to switch to teaching in Russian, and they start sending teachers from the empire itself to instructing students according to the Russian curriculum, of course. And they also try by force to convert the local Ukrainian population, which is not in Bukovina, but here in Galicia is mostly Ukrainian Catholic. They start forcing them to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. And they're very explicit about that. This region is Russian. it needs to become Russian. And those policies are very different from Russian occupations elsewhere, like in Eastern Prussia or the Caucasus, where the Russian occupation was very harsh, but there was no attempt to remake the region. Now, this occupation ended in 2015. Both the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and this violence was overshadowed by other things happening during the war. So it's barely known even within Ukraine itself. I mean, I'm from the region. My great-grandparents lived through this occupation. I knew almost nothing about it when I started to write the book. And what is even more remarkable about all those policies, that they're almost a copy-paste of what Russia is doing in the occupied areas of eastern and southern Ukraine in 2022. So for me, it was an absolutely schizophrenic experience, reading historical documents and memoirs in the morning and then in the afternoon to open the news and seeing almost the same things done by Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine with two exceptions. No anti-Jewish pogroms, simply because no Jews are left there, although the anti-Semitic rhetoric still exists, and no mass campaign of converting locals into Orthodox Christianity, because most of them are already Orthodox Christians, though they are forced to switch to the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate rather than the local churches. But other than that, you could just change the name of the town and the date, and you will get almost the same policies across more than 100 years. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Russian authorities in eastern and southern Ukraine right now are taking out of retirement all policies that they tried in 1914. I'm pretty certain that no one in the Kremlin, unless they read my book, even knows what the Russian Empire did in 1914 in Galicia and Bukovina. What I'm saying, though, is that since the ideas, the perceptions, and the goals remain the same, they lead to pretty similar policies across 100 years. Now, I have something like 5 to 7 minutes, so I will be brief. Another thing that I'm trying to say is that obsession with Ukraine is a choice. It's not a destiny. No one and nothing forces the Kremlin to adopt those policies. And in fact, there were periods in which the Russian government did try different things. They were brief, they failed, but I think it's important to understand what was going on there and why they failed, with the hope that, if Russia does try again to win itself off this Ukrainian obsession, they will know better what to do. And here, for me, the most important period is the 1990s. The Soviet Union collapses, Russia and Ukraine become independent states, and that's an opportunity to build a different relationship between those countries. President Yeltsin can and should be criticized for many things, but at least when it came to Ukraine, he instinctively understood that for Russia to get over this imperial Soviet legacy, Ukraine has to be independent. The majority of the population, though, did not see Ukraine as an independent real state, but they were also too busy trying to survive the economic crisis. So there was an opportunity for the Russian liberals to build a different narrative, a different story of relations between Russia and Ukraine. And Russian liberals, again, they did want to build a prosperous democratic Russia. On that, their heart was in the right place. So there was a moment of opportunity. What did they do to build this different perception of Ukraine among the Russians? The answer is nothing. Why? Because they believed that the only way to build a prosperous democratic Russia, which is not a threat to itself or its neighbors, it's investing in formal institutions and the economy. Institutions and prosperity, they thought, is the way to go forward. That's what creates this peaceful, secure, democratic, liberal Russia. They ignore the identity, the history questions altogether, in part simply because most of them were economists. They did not think about those issues. In part because it was harder for them to build a different narrative. It was easy to say, for the Polish liberals to say, well, we are building something new which is not Russia, we are returning to Europe. Russian liberals did not have this luxury, but they did not even try. Instead, they were mostly focused on the economy, and when the economic reforms failed, there was absolutely no reason for the Russian population to support the liberals' vision of peaceful and economic Russia. The opposition, the so-called red-brown coalition for the red of the communists and the brown of the fascists, they were removed from economic decision-making in the 1990s. So instead, the only thing they did was to talk about identity. Here, let me give you some examples. The communists. For them, the only way to recreate the Soviet Union was for Russia to take over Ukraine. The Soviet Union collapsed because Ukraine voted for independence. They did not want to have a Soviet Union with the Tajikistans and the Uzbekistans. There is no Soviet Union without Ukraine from their perspective. The conservatives. For them, the key figures, so the pretty useful figures, examples here are Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who is absolutely revered in the West for his opposition to communism, but he was also a pretty extreme Russian nationalist. For him, the way forward was to a state that would have Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, maybe northern Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, and he was very explicit about that, is not a real state. If they're crazy enough to go their own, let them do it, but only in their true, quote-unquote, ethnographic borders, meaning without eastern and southern Ukraine, and definitely not Crimea. Those areas need to be returned to Russia. He was also one of the very few people who, even as early as late 1980s, talked about the possibility of the war between Russia and Ukraine and was not taken seriously, but he believed that it can happen. The second most powerful politician in Russia in the 1990s, Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, he got himself declared persona non grata in Ukraine by going to Crimea and saying that Crimea should be returned to Russia. He also tried to construct a bridge that would connect Crimea and mainland Russia without even consulting the Ukrainian government. So once they got wind of that, they shut the project down. But that was the first infrastructure project that the Kremlin did after they annexed Crimea in 2014. And the radicals, Limonov, the head of the National Bolshevik Party, and Alexander Dugin, the geopolitics guru, they envisioned Russia as a continental empire for different reasons. But for them, rebuilding Russia as an empire not just has to include Ukraine, it has to start with Ukraine. And it's easy to dismiss those people as crackpots. I mean, Dugin has been called Putin's brain. He's not Putin's brain, of course, and it's becoming harder and harder to dismiss him as a crackpot since he's on CNN being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria something like 2 weeks ago. But whatever Dugin said 20 years ago and was laughed out of the room as crazy stuff, well, now Putin is saying it almost verbatim. Dugin, by the way, was also the first person to recreate the map of partitioned Ukraine with eastern and southern Ukraine being called Novorossiya. And since liberals became irrelevant because they failed with the economic reforms, that was the only identity vision, the only identity option available for the Russian public. And it became so commonplace that even the liberals started using this imperial language. For instance, Boris Chubais, one of the key people behind Yeltsin's economic reform, now his vision for Russia is a liberal empire. I have no idea what liberal empire is, but we'll have to ask him. And some went even further, 2 minutes, okay? Because it's a fun slide. We know that in 2007, 2008, pretty much everyone in the Kremlin was busy reading a book called The Third Empire, Russia as It Should Be. It hasn't been translated into English. It's also a pretty horrible, boring book, so I read it so that you won't have to. The author is a pretty prominent politician in the 1990s, the vice speaker of the Russian parliament from a liberal party, Yabloko. And that's his vision for Russia in about 2050. So what Russia is? Obviously, it's an empire. The world, according to him, is divided into 5 What do I do? Okay. Why is what? Okay. Yeah, so when I present, and that's Russia, obviously the entire continent, plus the UK. So whenever I present it in the UK, they focus on that. Sorry. And Greenland, of course, but when I present it in Canada, they're absolutely horrified by that part, and I can understand them. But so what Russia is in 2050? Well, obviously it's an empire. Obviously it's governed by a Tsar. How Russia becomes an empire? Well, it's easy. It defeats the US in a nuclear war with super weapons developed by Russian scientists. But what is even more interesting is how Russia starts becoming an empire. And it obviously starts with Ukraine, a country that, according to the book, I absolutely, no. What did I do? Yeah, okay. A book that, according to the book, it starts with Ukraine because Ukraine irritated the Russian elites by the very fact of its existence. I love this quote, but the scenario is even more fascinating. So it's 2007. There is a crisis in Ukraine over disputed elections. There are small protests that eventually grow and increase in power in the eastern and southern parts of the country. And when the government in Kyiv, which is pro-Western, moves in to crack down on those protests, the protesters ask Moscow for help. The Kremlin sends the troops, defeats the Ukrainian army somewhere in the area of the Donbas, threatens to use nuclear weapons to prevent the US from intervening. And after defeating the Ukrainians, there is a referendum. There is a new state called Novorossiya, which is immediately annexed by Russia. And then, after a couple of years, the rest of Ukraine follows. If you know anything about 2014 and 2022, that's exactly how things unfolded on the ground, to the extent that I know quite a few people who believe that instead of reading it as a boring science fiction book, people in the Kremlin back then read it as a to-do manual. I won't go that far. I don't think that's correct. But again, that's another example of how the same ideas, the same perception over time lead to similar results. So I will stop here, and thank you.
Yes, you can sit or stand.
Okay, maybe I'll stand. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eugene, for first of all writing this book, for presenting it here. It's really an interesting experience for a historian, looking at political scientists, looking back at 200 years of history, looking for one argument, for one intent. I probably would be kicked out from the Department of History for making that argument. But that's what also where the beauty comes, that different disciplines have different perspectives and insights. And for me, there was a lot of insights. The material per se was certainly very familiar, but the interpretation was interesting, and certain things that I never thought about became suddenly obvious to a degree that, oh my gosh, how I didn't think about that myself. And that was in particular your interpretation of the divide and suppress that really through a long period of time, certainly 20th century, for sure, when you look at the Soviet policies, the different ethnic groups and cultural groups were not hit at the same time, or most of the time, right? So in that sense, as you are right in that, when the Jews were hit, the Ukrainians were okay. When the Ukrainians were hit, the Jews were not touched for that period of time. And you can add Poles and Greeks and others. So again, thank you. It's very, very interesting experience when your area, your turf, is being invaded by the someone coming from a different department from across the corridor. So it is. I'm very grateful for that. I will make a number of comments on and then also ask questions that you can maybe engage and or ignore, depending of what you think about those questions. But the three themes will be the themes exactly coming from your book. The first one is about identity, then about the security, and then the issue of violence. And the issue of identity, for me, it's also, I think that your time frame, 200 years, basically works, because that brings us back to the 1820s, 1830s. And this is exactly the period of time when the concept of the one big Russian nation starts falling apart. And the trick is that among the people who formed the idea of one Russian nation are a lot of people coming from Ukraine, from Kiev in particular. So what our Russians are trying to do through good part of the 19th century, they're trying, first of all, not to allow the split of what they consider to be their nation to happen and occur. And from that point, you're absolutely right that the main battle is the battle with the Polish influence, cultural, political, and also economic influence in the territories that used to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But the threat that the Ukrainian movement and the Belarusian movement is not there yet is actually bigger for the Russian Empire, which undergoes the process of nationalization, than the challenge of the Poles, because the Poles are outside force, they're outside enemy. The Jews are outside enemy. All of them are within the Russian Empire, but the Ukrainian movement is especially horrible because it undermines the concept and the idea of Russianness itself. So that goes to the core, and before there is a repression and suppression, there is an attempt actually to arrest the development of the Ukrainian national project within the Russian one, so which adds maybe a little bit of nuance to what you're saying, but also stresses to what degree Ukraine has been central for Russia's understanding of itself from very early on. And the big question for me is how this is happening, that the Galicia of 1915 repeats itself in Donbass of 2015 or 2014, skipping over to a degree the Soviet period, because you start with these three quotes, and they're pretty close, except that the Soviet quote from Molotov recognizes Ukrainians as a separate group, but says that they're brotherly, right? So it's the Soviet really legitimization of their entering the Second World War was the call of blood, the people of the same blood, and we have to support them. Echoes with Russia, but still different. And Putin, in his essay from June of 2021 on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, is very unhappy with Lenin, very unhappy even with Stalin, because they recognized Ukrainians as a separate group. And he goes back to Constantine. He goes back to Russia in Galicia in 1915. So my question is, how unique it is. You also explain of how it is happening, that there is no other alternatives, or other alternatives were somehow defeated in the 1990s. But how unique this whole phenomenon of going back 100 years back, for not just for Putin, but for the Russian intellectuals, and trying to make Russia great again, looking not at the 1950s like it is apparently happening in the United States, but looking at 1850s. So that's my question on identity. So what do you do with the Soviet period, which really was a period where at least a lot of horrible things were happening, but the existence of the nation was recognized, the language was allowed in the schools, and so on and so forth. In terms of security, I agree with you 100% that the democratic Ukraine, imagined as part of Russia, presents the immediate threat to the regime that is built its legitimacy on the idea that, okay, Russia is too big to be democratic and has a very different tradition. So it is the threat that NATO actually never presented and never will be able to present. We see that also in the fact that Russian troops somehow are not moved from Ukraine to border with Finland, being concerned about NATO, but the border with Finland is still empty. So that suggests that NATO is maybe not a factor at all, or it is a factor. So everyone is talking about NATO, Mearsheimer and others, and certainly what you hear more and more coming from Washington these days. So given that the national security, the way how you interpret it, the security of the regime really depends so heavily on Ukraine. Where is not NATO in all of that story? It's just a smokescreen, or this is something that plays role, and then what role it plays? And finally, on violence, and I really think that you're drawing parallels between Galicia and Donbass, 1915 and 2015, is very interesting. You also mentioned that the turning the Orthodox churches, all Orthodox churches, into Moscow Patriarchate. That's the story of union, right? That's the story of Galicia also in 1915. And they're not going after Jews, but they're going after the Protestant groups, right? So there is still an element, there is still a religiously defined enemy that has to be turned into the mother Russian church, and another group that has to be destroyed or chased out. So the parallels actually are even more pronounced. But I also accept your interpretation of Russians planning to subjugate, and then once there is a resistance, there is also a violence. And there is a revenge, and you are a traitor. I think it all explains very well what is happening there. But on the other hand, I think I don't need this explanation. The question that I have, why Russians would behave differently in Ukraine than they behaved in Chechnya, when they behaved in 1945 in Germany, when they behaved in Afghanistan, or before Ukraine was Syria, right? So it's almost like, okay, that's if we think about something in historic terms, that's the way how the country fights the war, and violence is part of the. So again, it's not to say that I agree 100% with what you're saying in terms of how it turns, and you also chronologically almost can show how there is this realization in Russian armies happening in 2022 that these people are not going to welcome you. But it's almost you don't need this explanation, because there is other one. And whether you can say anything about the violence against the civilians as the form of the Russian, either imperial army or the Soviet army, which would be Russian imperial army was also multi-ethnic, right? And today's Russian army is multi-ethnic, but still there is a particular way how you do that. So that would be my second question. What is the relation between those? So again, thank you once again, and I look forward to discussions.
So should they do it here or should they stand?
You can sit, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay.
So why don't you, so we will have questions, but maybe you'd like to just give brief response to some of these before we open it up.
Okay, so, thank you. So, thanks.
I think if you press, I think you've now just turned it off.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Always do it wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sari. Those are great. Now, on history versus political science and, being an interloper, guilty as charged. Absolutely.
You're welcome.
But, and that's, that's an anecdote that, another reason why this book came about as a 200 story. Well, there is an analytical reason that I tried to understand the violence, but also when I was pitching the book, as I envisioned it back then to the editors, there was a wonderful conversation that I had with one of the editors. So they read the proposal. They say, well, it's fine, but it's on the current war. Everyone is writing a book on the current war. Even Plokhy is writing a book on the current war. So why don't you do something historical?
Okay, that makes sense, yes.
So, I mean, that wasn't the only reason, but it stuck. It stuck in the memory. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I think so. It's not just it's not just coming with a different approach to history. It's also the chutzpah of trying to do it, and yeah, and I have that in droves. Anyhow, so to your questions. So how does So Galicia, 1915, repeating itself in Donbass in 2015, or right now in eastern and southern Ukraine. How unique it is, I honestly don't know. I think a lot of what we see right now in Ukraine is actually, if not entirely unique, but pretty close to being unique. Now, I know analytically how those tropes are being reproduced, because we can, a part of that is a part of the intellectual groundwork for those ideas and those perceptions has been going on since early 2000s, when many of the books produced by the Club of Russian Nationalists in Kiev in the early 20th century are reprinted in contemporary Russia and distributed in contemporary Russia. Actually, the term of Ukraine as anti-Russia comes from a preface to one of those reprinted texts and then catches on. So there is a lot of intellectual work by contemporary Russian nationalists trying to revive those texts and those ideas and those arguments. I think it's also, the scopes of what they want to achieve lend themselves to similar policies. If you want to make them Russians and you understand how important education is, then of course you would target the educational system. And once you decide that you want to change the educational system, your policy options become quite limited. Part of that, I think, is they're also stuck in their thinking to a large degree in how they approach things, but I honestly can't tell you the exact mechanism, why exactly we converge on the same policies, not just ideas. I think we'll have to understand more. In glossing over the Soviet period now, obviously in the book I do talk about the Soviet period. I have a couple of chapters. I think that Putin and people around him decided just to skip the Soviet period as being this historical mistake, or building on the perception of the Soviet Union of, well, what do we call it in English? Reddish, so a tiny red veneer, and underneath a heavy white core, and that's how, by the way, several immigrants talked about the Soviet Union. That it's essentially the same Russian Empire with a communist superstructure. But if you look at what Putin reads, who he likes, who he prefers to say, those are all 19th, early 20th century Tsarist intellectuals and thinkers. So I'm not surprised they decided just to skip, it as somehow historical mistake. Where the NATO unit? Well, I was expecting to find NATO. When I went to discuss, when I read all those people like Dugin and other Russian nationalist intellectuals, by and large, then NATO is not there. They're not talk about the need to control Ukraine for historical reasons, for linguistic reasons, for ethnic reasons, for imperial reasons, you name it. But it's not about NATO. NATO is just not part of those discussions, with the exception of Dugin. Dugin does talk about NATO a bit, but for him, NATO is separate from Ukraine. There is a question of NATO, which is in Europe, and it prevents Russia, or it's a threat to Russia becoming a continental empire. It needs to be dealt with. And there is the question of Ukraine that needs to be controlled for historical and ideological reasons. They do talk about NATO, though, when they switch to English. And the audience changes from domestic audience that understands all the discourse to trying to talk, especially when we're talking about officials or people close to the regime. They know what will resonate. That's when you see NATO popping up. But again, you mentioned Finland. You don't need Finland. After all, Soviet Union and Ukraine and NATO have a border since the very beginning of the alliance. That's Norway. Up north, the most forgotten NATO border, but there is nothing new between Soviet Union having a border with NATO, and somehow it's not really a concern. Crimea at the 1990s, nobody mentioned NATO, not even Dugin. Like, Crimea is Russia, Russia, Russia. It needs to be Russian. NATO is not part of the story. So NATO is not there, but again, if you don't know the context, if you don't know the language, like people like Mearsheimer and others, who do not know the context and cannot access, the domestic discourse and what those people say when they speak in Russian, then yes, you will decide that it's all about NATO, especially if your theory predicts that it has to be about NATO. In terms of violence, so why would they behave differently? Well, the distinction that I'm making here is, places, is what we call in our jargon indiscriminate violence. That's Mariupol, for instance. And you're absolutely right, there is no much difference between Mariupol and Grozny is part of Russia itself, versus Aleppo, or you can go back to Afghanistan. That's just how Russians fight. So for me, Mariupol was absolutely not surprising. That's part of the doctrine, that's part of the thinking. For me, what was more surprising is the more targeted violence of places like Bucha. So Bucha I did not expect, honestly. I did not expect them going house to house and executing people. It's also not what we saw in Donbass since 2014, by and large. I mean, of course there was violence, of course there was repression, but nothing on the same scale of Bucha. And that for me intellectually was a surprise, especially again, if you factor in the Russian perceptions of Ukrainians as brothers, and especially in places like Bucha and northern and eastern Ukraine, they speak the same language. Many of them are ethnic Russians. When I went over testimonies of people from Bucha, quite a few of them were actually Putinists and ethnic Russians. And it did not prevent the violence. That's why I think the revenge parts come in. You don't need this dynamic to explain Mariupol or many other smaller towns and cities that got obliterated in the Donbass, but the more targeted violence, who gets targeted, why? For that you need this ideological background, and that's a different type of violence. So we have two types of violence going on, which is very indiscriminate, and there course, a lot of discussion whether the violence is genocidal or not. So I personally do not view Mariupol as genocidal. It's a crime against humanity, it's a war crime, but there is no intent to destroy a group as such. Bucha and other type of targeted violence behind the front line is where we get to the idea that Ukrainians need to be destroyed as a group. And that also goes back to the title of the book, Intent to Destroy.
Thank you. All right, so happy to open it up for questions. Okay, I'll create a list here. Carl, and you could introduce yourself as well.
I'm Carl Kaiser. I'm an associate of the center here. You're quite right to point to the difference between the justification internal in Russia and what they tell to the West. Mearsheimer being, of course, a victim of that. Putin is always pointing to NATO. There is a difference. However, when you look at another part of the discussion, the justification of the special operation, the notion of the West appears. The West, both in the Russian discussion, but also in the discussion that the West reads, I mean, that is available in English or what they use in their outside propaganda. The West being the opponent of Russia, being also decadent. We are fighting for a morally superior Russia. The West is decadent, no family values, and all of that argument. So there is there the West appears at least. There is a difference between the NATO argument and the West against Russia argument. And I was wondering what you think about that point.
Right. So do we go one by one?
go ahead,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. So you're absolutely right. But there is a difference. There is a difference between NATO and the West. NATO, at least as discussed by people like Mearsheimer or Walt and others, it's explicitly a security threat. Right? It's a national security concern. They're there. It's a threat to the border. The West is ambiguous. It's an idea. It's not a security threat. By the way, they switched from talking about the West to talking about Anglo-Saxons. That's now their boogeyman. It's not so much about the West. The West as such. That's not a security threat. That's an intellectual and identity threat or a challenge that needs to be dealt with. You're absolutely right. Ukraine does fit into this narrative because they view Ukraine as a tool of this nefarious, conspiracy theoretical West that is after Russia and tries to destroy it. But again, when I don't see it as part of the national security argument because it's not an institution that you can point to and say, how many divisions this gay Europa that they say have. Right? Unlike when the discussion, among my colleagues goes on, well, it's about bases, it's about missiles, it gets very technical. Here we're talking about perception. So I'm fully on board with you. But again, part of my motivation to write the book was just to show that it's not about NATO and it's not about measurable security that people in strategic studies talk about. It's more about ideas, and West absolutely feeds this perception of ideas.
And after all, the West is Satan.
Well, the West is many things. The West is many things that Russians don't like, Satan being one of them. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on this? I mean, so the way you present it is that the NATO argument is really for external consumption only. And I'm wondering, I mean, there would be another version. I'm just wondering if this is plausible at all, that maybe it begins as an argument for external consumption, but becomes an argument that works internally as well. I mean, does it become part of the explanation, or is it remain?
So I don't see.
Yeah.
I just don't see it in the Russian discourse. So the
even
West,
even today. I mean,
even today, yeah.
Yeah.
Even today, at least internally, in Russia, they're talking about the West more as in this ideological concept. So that goes more to the regime security concept. So we have Russian regime, which is autocratic, religious, conservative, morally upright, whatever it is, and the West threatens it. But the threat is again more ideational / ideological rather than measurable security. You can't measure the West.
Yeah.
Like, speaking in our jargon.
Right, okay. Yeah, and I guess, I mean, any discussion about Ukraine ends up being about Mearsheimer, which is really unfortunate. But, I mean, I guess.
We can make it about Walt if you want to.
Yes, right. But I guess the argument is that, their argument would be, well, people may not be saying it, but that's really the underlying factor. But I guess that's a
But they
non-falsifiable.
I just don't see it. So
Yeah.
I try to find
Yeah.
I can't.
Okay, right, good, thank you.
They don't care about it.
Okay, here in the front row, yes, yes.
Tom Johnson, UMass Boston. Review for the ALA highly recommends intent to destroy while also suggesting that the analysis could go farther back in time to the early 18th century or even to the late 17th century. And this pushes the time span into periods covered in Professor Clokey's early work. So the question is, would a longer time span shed more light, less light, or about the same amount on what is Ukraine's current ramifying tragedy? Thank you to both of you for your answers.
Thank you, Tom. So you're right. Yeah, I start with. So part of it is just, I was given a word count by the publisher that I had to squeeze so much in that I simply couldn't go. I mean, I get this point. Why don't you start with the 17th century, or why don't you start even earlier? So part of it is practical. Part of that is, yes, I have the chutzpah, to trespass into history, but not going back, So 19th century I can handle. I think, below that it's Professor Splochy territory, and I personally don't feel that, I will be able to say much new here. But even more important, I think for my purposes, 19th century works because that's exactly when we see the birth of Russian political nationalism and ideas about Russia being a political nation rather than something else. So it would be very interesting to write this long history. Someone else will have to write it, not me. I'm done here. Whether it will shed more light, probably yes, but I think for the argument that I want to present, not much more light. But again, I would defer to Sergey because he is the expert here, not me.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that looking at the 19th and 20th century makes much more sense. Again, you talk about the political Russian project, but it's also the time when you have the disintegration of this concept of one big Russian nation, and that's where the story really starts. If you would go back into the 17th century, you would deal, of course, with the Cossack, with the statehood, with the autonomy. So it's a different set of issues that, again, are important for Russo-Ukrainian relations. They start, in a way, in mid-17th century. But that perspective, I think, where you have the identity issue in terms of nationality, that's really the story of the 19th century. And thinking in the way how far the mostly the Russian discourse goes in the past. Again, the Putin's reference to the Austrian general staff that concocted the very idea of Ukraine, and the concern, outside concern, was about Austria-Hungary. And Ukrainians were on both sides, and that was immediately the issue of the security. So I think that also works quite well. Don't think that I'm trying to protect my turf and not to allow anybody into the 18th century, but I think it worked quite well in terms of the
Because of this
chronological
nationalism question. I mean, is that the point?
Yeah.
Maybe you gentlemen can co-author a future book, perhaps with a more generous publisher. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. So, Evgeny Monastirskiy, I'm a second-year PhD student here and also Center Associate. Again, thank you for the book. I haven't read it yet, just happened, it's not on my exam list. So there are a couple comments, first of all, about the whole Mearsheimer thing. It doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense, specifically if you go into, for instance, like interviews with the Russian POWs, they were talking about Gayropa. They will be talking, like, if you will watch a certain amount of those interviews, one will find mostly conversation about values, and most of the values will end up of them being, I'm an Orthodox, and I don't like this, and I don't like what, and I don't like gay parades. and this would be the omnipresent trope. There will be no conversation of I don't like NATO at my borders. That would be a tropes of the federal news. And if you go on the local news in Russia, there will be also no NATO conversation. There will be also again the values conversation, which is weird. But again, one have to spend enough time reading all of this absolute crackpot of the of information. So this is like absolutely makes sense. I also think that's the Bucha difference is not a revenge. Is the question of what's happened in 2014 in comparison, and I do think that the comparison with 1915 makes perfect sense, works just ideally. Like I do understand this bunch of historians will despise it, but like it's their problem. The thing with 2014 was the pretense of civil war. And you cannot go house by house and kill people in the civil war, in which when you try to pretend that you protect people. So this is like, but my question is more about about 90s and about you paid, you gave a lot of credit to Yeltsin for not doing things, but don't you think it's kind of not really how it worked out, because Yeltsin was distracted. Not only what was going on within Russia, and Russia trying to be a good state for in a relationship with the West, but in one of the latest interviews before he passed, Kravchuk, who was the first president of Ukraine, mentioned this Crimea was actually on the table in the conversation. Mishkov was a problem. Mishkov was president of Crimea. There was a weird institution for about a couple of years in the first couple of years of independence of Ukraine, and specifically because in December '94 Chechnya started. He got distracted, and there was like a Kuchma also mentions in his Ukraine is not Russia book. That's this whole Crimea was there.
Right. So Crimea was absolutely a point of tension. But what we know about Yeltsin, that he believed that for Russia to overcome this imperial legacy, to become a normal state, Ukraine has to be independent. Putin does not. And there were more opportunities. I mean, so yes, they pressured Ukraine. Yes, they used economic tools when they wanted to. Of course, they browbeat Ukraine together with the U.S. in the nuclear weapons issue, and there was a lot of pressure from Russia on the U.S. to pressure Ukraine, and the U.S. acquiesced. But overall, his thinking was that Ukraine still needs to be independent. In terms of whether he was distracted, I mean, to some extent, yes. You get many things happening, but he also tried to do things. So, for instance, he created a committee to develop a new Russian national idea. Nothing came out of it, but at least he was thinking in those terms that Russia needs a new history, a new understanding of what it is. It hasn't been completed. It hasn't even actually produced much. But so what I'm going with, it's not just Yeltsin though. It's the other people around him, people like Gaidar and Chubais, who were not even thinking in those terms. And Yeltsin couldn't push for this change in narrative. Couldn't push for this change in narrative alone, but he also understood the damage that not focusing on Russian history does. He also understood the damage that the narrative, or the talk about Crimea among the communists and the parliament does. So, for instance, for the book, I interviewed Andrei Kozyrev, who was his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he talked about how, after every crazy declaration about in the Russian parliament to annul the transfer of Crimea, or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there would be wars in Ukraine, and then it would be their job, to minimize, to control the damage and going back and trying to fix the relationship. So it's easy for me, to blame the Russian liberals. They made mistakes, absolutely. But again, I think they did want to build a better Russia. They did not understand how to do it, including Yeltsin himself. Probably, if he could foresee what would happen, my guess, he would have spent more time on this issue. I don't know if it answers your question. So.
No, it's okay. It makes perfect sense again. There's in the position of the hindsight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
From two Ukrainian presidents who were dealing with this in the first 5 years. For them, Crimea was more painful.
Yes, but for Yeltsin it was a distraction. So they had to deal with it, but he didn't really want to deal with it, right? He was forced by people like Yeltsin and the communists who kept bringing it to the table. If it was up to Yeltsin, he would just moved on and never not touch it not touch it again. So the idea, so this chapter on the liberals and what they did wrong, it's more forward-looking. If Russia ever tries to democratize and build a better Russia, then probably democracy itself will not be enough, from what we understand. They also need to change the narrative and the perception of Ukraine.
Yeah, so just one quick follow-up on that, and there's other questions. I mean, so you presented that slide, you said that the alternative is sort of this kind of path not followed, but I mean, the way you're describing it sounds like it was really a utopian, naive, and so, I mean, I guess my question would be, I mean, where does this all leave us? I mean, at the end of the day, whatever you want to say about Mearsheimer, at least there's an argument about how one could get a different outcome. I mean, he may be entirely wrong, but so from your account, I mean, this is about identity. Usually when one talks about identities within any national context, there's multiple strands of identities. I mean, for example, the Soviet kind of account of kind of theories of, Lenin's and Stalin's theories of nationalism. This would be an alternative narrative or an alternative framework that could lead, to a different outcome. So is there really an alternative narrative within this context that offers a different path out of this? And so what is that?
Absolutely. So yes, I'm actually more optimistic than many other people, and I don't think that Russian obsession with Ukraine is deterministic. It's a result of political choices. And again, here probably had Yeltsin known what the outcome would be, he would have made different choices, and the liberals would have made different choices, and also would have probably brought historians to their team and started working on those issues. Why I'm more optimistic? Because we see that Russian perceptions of Ukraine also change over time. So, Galicia, which was absolutely Russian in 1914, 1939, now even the most rabid Russian nationalists, they don't want Galicia. Why? Because they encountered too much resistance there, and they stopped talking about those people as Russians and seeing this region as Russia. And Russian authorities are actually quite successful in manufacturing their identity. So I think it does. Yeah, I think it can change if there is. We know how current Russian vision of Ukraine came up. It was through education. It was through official ideology. It was through political choice. It was through investment in culture. And I think that if Russia does decide to change, they can do it. They have done it before. Again, Galicia being the prime example. So what is needed is a political will. It will not come unless Russia is defeated, I think.
But is there a intellectual constituency that has that vision at least on offer? I mean, is there something, or is this something that you only can see from the outside?
So I think there can be. Actually, I think it's a speculation, but having read a bit of history, I'm pretty sure that there are right now conversations going on among Russian soldiers in Ukraine and their families. Are those people brothers? Do we even need them? But it can be bottom up. It should be also supplemented by top-down choices to create a different narrative. But I think it can look. Germans have given up on Königsberg, right? Poles have given up on Galicia. Like, I mean, they were willing to fight to the death for Galicia. No more. Italians have given up on the Adriatic. So it can be done. Those narratives change if there is a political will. It will not come from Putin, absolutely. It will not happen until and unless Russia is defeated. But in some distant future, I'm more optimistic.
Do you have any
than
thoughts
most
on this? Yeah.
May I jump in? Yeah, because about intellectual intellectual constituency there. I don't think it is in Russia. It is now here. So those people were chased out of Russia. But they're extremely important because if you think about the ideas of the Russian imperial identity, those were also people in immigration, Solzhenitsyn and others, right? And Ilyin and Denikin and others who are now big heroes for Dugin and for Putin. So it's very important given that traditionally, whether it's Soviet Russia or Imperial Russia or Putin's Russia, there is very little space for intellectual debate and discussion. That's why immigration is so important, because they're creating the alternatives that can't be created at home. And in that sense, again, I think it's important what is happening here at Harvard, at other universities, at other places, because we don't have that constituency in Russia. But those who now are running with this imperial ideas, they didn't have it in 1950s or 1960s or 1970s in the Soviet Union as well.
What did you? Yeah.
How are you? I have two questions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of territory in this longue durée story that you're talking about. You've spoken a little bit about forms of violence directed against human beings, right, in certain sites. But I wonder if there's a story to be told about change or lack of change in the way that Russian military forces have interacted with the physical territory of Ukraine. And if so, does that shed any light on how the Russian relationship with Ukraine as state, as concept, as people, and as territory, how those things play out? I'm just thinking about in the wake of 2014 and the second annexation of Crimea, right? One of the very first things that happened in Moscow was the celebration of the concept of the Crimean landscape, right? There was all kinds of talk about people and all that, but the way that the space itself is conceptualized and exoticized, but then also there's a lot of violence being directed at the Ukrainian space right now. So I'm just curious what you think about that. And then the other kind of crazy thought that came into my head as I was listening to you talk, and trying to kind of tease out this question of how essential Ukraine is to the very existence of Russia, right? And I had this moment, imagine a scenario in which there's a map where there's no map that mentions Ukraine, right? There's no memory of Ukraine. No one is speaking Ukrainian anymore. The idea of Ukraine has been simply wiped away, and that space is now just Russia. And all you see, it's just Russia. Is that even a viable outcome? Or would Russia simply somehow collapse into itself because it doesn't have this necessary concept of something else that is somehow a part that it needs in order to exist? And you can not address that at all, but I just love this idea of taking the idea of destroy Ukraine to its ultimate expression and figure out if I think that might even destroy Russia, right?
Right, so, I would love to see Russia collapsing on itself, but before they wipe Ukraine. So on space, honestly, I haven't even thought about that. Now, you are an historian of space. I'm an historian of violence against people, so that's my natural inclination. I honestly haven't thought about that. I would love to talk to you more about that, though. What will happen if this now? No, I don't think that Russia will collapse among itself. And every time I presented, after the talk during the talk, there is a question. Typically, someone who is either a Pole or a Balt who say, "Well, if it's all about Ukraine, are we off the hook?" And my answer is no, you are not. because once Ukraine is gone, they will still have, Ukraine is an end, but it's also a means to a different, much bigger end. So I don't think that Russia collapse on itself. There will still be, this nefarious West that needs to be dealt with. There are always the Balts. There are some other targets. So I don't think that, not having. So for now, Ukraine is this other, but it's also a proxy for the Anglo-Saxon West. So I think no, and the Balts are absolutely not of that.
So our last question goes to Peter Gordon.
Last question.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. It was fascinating, and I'm by no means knowledgeable about Ukraine and Russia and the current struggle. But your talk was very sobering. I have to say, as someone who's interested in democratic values, I was struck by the fact that your talk is really about national identities and the construction of different national identities. National identities can sometimes nourish democratic movements, democratic values, democratic sentiments. Sometimes, of course, they don't. And yet today, in the struggle that we're seeing, the very strong conception shared by people like me is that the struggle for Ukrainian independence is indeed one about the struggle for democratic self-determination against autocracy, not just against the Russian Empire as an empire, but against a certain autocratic image of Russia. And I would therefore just like to ask if you could broaden your sights a little bit beyond the actual struggle for Ukrainian national identity and national independence, and offer some insights for people like me as to why, well, I guess there are two questions here. One is going to sound rather obvious, but why this has become such a flashpoint in our conception of the democratic West and its fate, and then why we have this peculiar phenomenon in the United States about what seems to be a break with that conception, and a new alliance where, or at least the imagination of a new alliance where Ukraine would be demolished in favor of some post-NATO imperialist settlement. I mean, this is a very, very broad question, but I'm asking you in a way to turn away from the way you've told the story.
Right. So I think you're absolutely right about the connection between Ukrainian national identity and democracy. I think for me, I don't know if it will answer your question. I think for me the main takeaway about national identity that it can be made democratic, it can be made autocratic based on what elites want at a different moment of time. There is absolutely, people say that Russia cannot be democratic. I don't buy that. They can if they try hard enough, or that there is something inherently democratic about Ukraine. I also don't buy that. But the story that I'm telling is about choices of national identity and how those choices translate to democracy and autocracy. And I think that's also what we see in the US, where politicians can try and can shift national identity to more democratic or more autocratic to advance their political goals in terms of the US now. So, I work for a US institution, I'm a US citizen, but for the last almost 4 years, I live in Europe. So, my understanding of US politics right now is like opening the news and what the hell is going on. So I honestly have, I came back yesterday. I can't understand the country anymore. So I won't tell you much about American politics, but I think But I think destroying Ukrainian identity and democracy is absolutely crucial for Putin, for reasons of his regime survival and his perception of regime survival. Why people outside Russia, like President Trump, would go with that, beat me. I honestly cannot understand it. But that's probably doesn't answer your question. I stopped understanding what's going on in the US since November, probably even before that.
Well, we are at the Center for European Studies, so we have some understanding of what's happening in Europe, perhaps. But understanding what's happening in America is beyond our duty, although it's of all of our concern, of course. So thank you.
Thank you.
Ini Finkel, Serhii Ploki. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.